Okay, real briefly, I want to talk about, again, the flow of cerebrospinal fluid throughout the brain. Okay, now cerebrospinal fluid, it's a type of liquid that's very similar to the plasma of our blood, but there are some different compositions of it compared to plasma. Mainly, there's a lot less protein in it, and there's a little less bicarbonate within cerebrospinal fluid as well. But that's a good thing because that allows us to respond to changes in pH a lot more rapidly. Okay. So now what happens here? We have what are called the lateral ventricles of the brain. Okay, and these are deep within the cerebral hemispheres, kind of found just kind of underneath and along the sides of the corpus callosum, and as you can see, they project back towards the occipital lobe here. Okay, and then within the lateral ventricles and the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle, there's a specialized group of blood capillaries called the choroid plexus. Basically what these are capillaries that are surrounded by cells called ependymal cells. That what happens then, we filter blood out of here, and then those cells kind of they play a role in basically converting blood, the plasma that we filter out, into cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. Now this flow, what happens is flow begins up in the lateral ventricles. Remember, this is a view of just one hemisphere of the brain. Okay, so we have one lateral ventricle here, and there's another one on the other side. Okay, both these ventricles are filled with the choroid plexus. Okay, so then fluid starts to fill this ventricle up, and then what happens, it passes through this opening called the foramen of Monroe, or the interventricular foramen, inter meaning in between ventricular ventricles. Okay, and then that cerebrospinal fluid then travels from these two lateral ventricles down into what's called the third ventricle. Okay, and then as you can see, there's on the roof of the third ventricle, there's also a group of these specialized blood vessels called the choroid plexus, and these are also helping to produce cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so then CSF goes from the lateral ventricles down into the third. And then as the third ventricle is filling up, cerebrospinal fluid will then travel down this very narrow tubular passageway called the cerebral aqueduct, or more commonly the aqueduct of Sylvius. Okay, and then as cerebrospinal fluid travels down the aqueduct of Sylvius, it will then start to pool within the fourth ventricle, which, as you can see, is a triangularly shaped structure. We see half of it right here, found kind of caudal to the medulla oblongata and the pons, and slightly rostral to the cerebellum. Okay, and then again, you can also see there's a group of capillaries in here, also called the choroid plexus. Okay, now there are two openings within the fourth ventricle. One is called the median aperture, okay, or the foramen of Magendie. And then there are two lateral apertures, which are right about here, called the foramen of Luchka. Okay, and then cerebrospinal fluid is then pushed out of these apertures, and then it can then flow around the superficial aspects of the central nervous system. Now, cerebrospinal fluid specifically flows. Remember the three layers of the dura mater. You've got the meninges. You've got the dura mater, you've got the arachnoid mater, and then you've got the pia mater. Now there's a space, remember, in between the arachnoid and the pia mater called the subarachnoid space, and that's the area that the cerebrospinal fluid flows around. And the various areas of the central nervous system that CSF flows through are called cisterns, and these cisterns are named based on their locations. Like, for example, the chiasmatic cistern is found by the optic chiasm, and so on. Okay, we're not going to go over all these cisterns, but just understand those are the regions where this fluid is found. Okay. Now, cerebrospinal fluid, again, you can see down here at this, at the median aperture, some of the CSF is traveling down the spinal cord, and it's kind of, engulfing or surrounding this area. Okay, and then it'll eventually flow its way back up as well. And cerebrospinal fluid has a pressure of about maybe 5.5 to 7 millimeters of mercury. Okay, now that's important to know because, let's say someone accumulates excessive amounts of CSF, that's going to increase the amount of pressure in their central nervous system. Okay, and they'll see that when we're doing, for example, someone has to have a spinal tap. Okay, so then as the CSF is passing around, what happens is it eventually flows up and meets up with what are called these arachnoid granulations. Okay, basically these are, there are some fibers and some folds within the arachnoid matter, and this is where cerebral spinal fluid is then absorbed. And then eventually the CSF is absorbed into what's called the superior sagittal sinus, okay, and then it'll flow through the superior sagittal sinus and eventually meet up with venous blood and then get pumped back out into the system. Okay, now we have an example right here of the superior sagittal sinus. Now the superior sagittal sinus again is caused by folds in the dura mater. Remember, the dura mater in the skull is bilayered. It contains the periosteal layer and then the cerebral layer. Okay, and then the area where these two layers meet and fold, they form the superior sagittal sinus, where venous blood pools and also cerebral spinal fluid is absorbed into. And you can see right here, I'm putting this dull probe into the superior sagittal sinus of the brain itself, okay, of the dura mater. And there's also an inferior sagittal sinus that passes along the inferior aspect of the brain as well. Okay, but that's the basic route of cerebral spinal fluid. Now again, the whole purpose of cerebral spinal fluid is to basically kind of wash the brain, kind of clean metabolites out of the brain. And also it plays a role in communication with the brain. It can circulate some neuroendocrine hormones and prohormones all throughout the central nervous system, so we can have some communication going on. And remember, we produce on average, depending on what book you read, between 400 to 500 milliliters of cerebral spinal fluid per day, and we completely turn that over about 3 times per day. Okay, so that's the flow of CSF. And again, right here, you can also see the lateral ventricles. Okay, kind of underneath the corpus callosum. And then as we look at some other cuts of the brain, you will get to see the choroid plexus and the other ventricles from different perspectives and points of view.